Welcome to the Museum of Everyone's Pride of Everyone series. The Museum of Everyone is an inclusive portable platform for artists and creatives that aims to amplify a diverse range of voices and perspectives through both artistic and community-led collaborative initiatives. The Museum of Everyone is a space for potential, collaboration, original thinking and action. Our ethos is simple. If you support your community in return will support you. To celebrate Pride Month, we aim to give voice to the minority groups within Ireland's queer community. With our esteemed guests, we will highlight ways in which the community compounds stigma and exclusion, but we will also explore ways to create a more inclusive and supportive community so that we really can have a pride of everyone. Hi, so this is our first in the Pride of Everyone series. Tonight we're going to be talking about trans and gender, and we're joined by some fantastic guests. So first of all, we have Noah Halpin and Cearbhall Turraoin. I got it right the first time and Olive Wilson. So in this discussion, with these talks, we really want to kind of focus on trying to open up the conversation around the kind of minority identities and how these identities are very often kind of hidden within the Irish queer community, but also within wider society. So we're going to just really kind of bring things back to basics and try to kind of introduce some of the identities that you know, people may hear terms used and may not always want to ask or may just assume that they know, but don't always, you know, it's kind of through conversations that we learn. So I personally identify as a lesbian cis woman. Cis is a term generally that refers to, and I could be wrong on this, but my understanding of cis is that it refers to somebody who to a gender representative of your biology, and that could be wrong, but anyway, so but for me personally, when I talk about cis, I also always feel that I need to clarify that by saying I identify as butch, which isn't always true of female representation. So there's a lot to unpack with that, and we'll be touching on some of these things. So first of all, I'm going to go to our first guest. So Noah Halpin, his pronouns are he and him. He is a trans binary man who he's currently the community aid officer with TENI, Trans Equality Network Ireland. He's the founder of the This Is Me campaign, and he's also a member of ACT UP Dublin, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So Noah, hiya. Thanks.
Hi, how are you?
For joining us. Yeah, good. So Noah, I'm going to ask you just really kind of simply, I mean, so many people have heard the term trans, but really what is it to be trans binary, and even what does the idea of binary mean? So if you can introduce us to that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would identify as a transgender man, but I'd identify as a binary trans person. So like you were saying, Han, like a cis person, you know, to explain it pretty easily, is a cisgender person is somebody who still identifies as the gender that they were born to. So for me, I'm transgender, and a binary trans person would mean that I do still identify within the male or female binary. However, I identify as the gender opposite to that of what I was born. So I was born into an assigned gender of female, but I identify in the opposite of that gender. So I identify as male, although I was not born as male. So I still identify within the male-female binary as a male. So it would mean that, being transgender is, basically means the opposite. So I transitioned from female to male, but I still identify within the binary. So, which would mean I am a transgender man, a binary transgender man.
Great. And just before I talk to Carol, because I know both yourself and Carol are involved with Tenny, and I'm going to be asking Carol about that. But I also know you were the founder of the This Is Me campaign. So can you just introduce what that was about?
Yeah, so I'm no longer, I've passed the book over to a really capable bunch of people. But in 2000 and December 2017, myself and a couple of others felt that, there was a need for maybe a grassroots campaign to join in along with other trans groups such as Tenny and the community in general, to start talking specifically about the lack of trans-specific or gender-affirming healthcare in Ireland. We felt that there was a space for a grassroots campaign, because whether you're grassroots or organizational, different places of different capacities and different, ways that they can campaign. So we started up the This Is Me campaign, which was purely volunteer-led, purely grassroots. And, we thought, we need to start shouting for healthcare. We didn't feel like the community itself felt safe enough to start as individuals. So we created a space where the community could join together to start advocating for, improved services for trans people when it came to gender affirming healthcare. So we kind of built that campaign up over, from December 2017 till now. We had quite a lot of successes, quite a lot of really disappointing moments as well. We spoke to a lot of politicians, a lot of HSE officials, sat in committees, national committees, led quite a lot of protests as well with great turnout. And then, when it's your kind of time to step aside and let some new younger voices with different ideas step up and let their voice be heard. And so I've kind of moved away from the This Is Me campaign, and I've left it, as I said, in some great hands. And now I am working with Tenny, or working for Tenny.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think really, the what you're saying about the kind of grassroots thing has really been evident in this country for the last kind of, 5, 6, 7 years, with the likes of kind of marriage referendum, the likes of the abortion repealing the eighth, and just even within the community, and particularly within the queer community, that we've really kind of managed to gain a lot through that. And thank you for your work in that, on behalf of the trans community, but also on behalf of the wider queer community. So Carol, I'll come to you. So Noah has spoken about what it is to be a binary trans person. So non-binary, I suppose, then kind of almost becomes self-evident, but it's really not, because I know there's a lot of diversity within that. So maybe you can introduce us to some of those ideas. Oh, and sorry, I should say, so your pronouns, first of all, are they, them. So maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, so in the same way that, Noah's pronouns are he and him, or, your pronouns are she and her, my pronouns are they and them. So if someone's talking about me in the third person, I prefer that they use they to refer to me rather than he or she, for that matter. Although she, I don't mind too much. I kind of go back and forth a little bit between they and she, but they is kind of the usual set that I use. But like same way Noah was talking a minute ago about for a trans man is someone who was assigned female at birth, but that's not the gender they identify with. They identify as male, so that guy will transition and identify as male. In the same way, for a non-binary person, they maybe assign one gender at birth, but they don't identify with that gender, and they don't identify with the opposite gender either. Or so they don't identify as either of those things. They may identify something that's not really related to masculinity and femininity or to male and female, or they may identify as some mixture of the two. So, for example, for me, my gender identity is kind of somewhere between neutral and feminine. If you imagine a spectrum between male and female, I'm kind of somewhere between right in the middle and kind of leaning more towards the feminine end of the spectrum. Other people may be somewhere else along that spectrum. And then other people, they might not want to identify in those terms at all. They might not want to identify their gender identity in terms of how it relates to male and female. So whereas, trans man and trans woman, while obviously there's a lot of variety within those, there's lots of different ways to be male and to be female, and that applies for trans people as well. For non-binary gender identity, it's a complete umbrella term. Like, there are some people who identify with the term non-binary itself. I identify that way myself, but there's a lot of different gender identities under the non-binary umbrella. So in the same way that, trans is an umbrella term that covers trans men, trans women, non-binary people, etc., non-binary itself is another umbrella term. So you might have, for example, someone who identifies as a demi-girl, which would be kind of something similar to me, who's someone who's, halfway between male and female, but maybe leaning towards, or sorry, not halfway between male and female, but on that spectrum between male and female, but closer to the female end. You have demi boys as well. You have neutra. There's lots of different terms people use. I know that can be kind of confusing for people, but I'm very fond of trying to explain non-binary gender identity with analogies. One of my favorite ones is, it's like, I know people who are born in Northern Ireland, for example, who don't identify themselves as Irish or British. They might identify themselves as Northern Irish, and they don't identify with the Republic or with the United Kingdom. They identify as someone who's from Northern Ireland, and they identify with that area, and that's their community. And kind of in the same way, we have there's a lot of recognition of nationalism and unionism. But if you're someone who's kind of, grew up in Northern Ireland but doesn't identify with either of those traditions, you're kind of in this, no man's land where you're not recognized by the system. It's kind of similar for non-binary people. So, we'll be getting on, I'm sure, to talk about, biological sex later on. But for gender identity is, a social construct. So people can take different parts of it and say, I identify strongly with this part of being male, for example, but I don't identify with a whole lot of it, and I don't want to call myself a male or a man. And there's a difference between identifying with a label and applying that label to yourself and saying, I am X, versus saying there are parts of these behaviors or these modes of expression and dress and mannerisms that I like, and I want to live my life this way. I want to behave in this way, but I don't want to apply that label to them to myself. So there isn't one neat non-binary identity that I can kind of lay out for you, because there's lots of different things within it. It's a bit like, imagine there's north and south, and most people identify as either north and most people identify as south, and some people are kind of on the equator, somewhere in between the two. And then some people aren't anywhere on the planet. They want to be off somewhere else and identify very differently. So, it's a complicated identity or term, because you're only saying really what the person isn't. And also I should say, just before I finish, that a lot, like, non-binary is part of the trans umbrella term. And there are a lot of non-binary people who identify as trans, but not all non-binary people identify as trans. That can be for a variety of different reasons. There's a lot of kind of for a lot of people, there's a lot of baggage attached to the term trans in terms of medical treatment and the idea of transitioning, which doesn't really make so much sense for non-binary people.
Of course.
But it is something that people can identify with if they so choose.
It's funny. I mean, when you talk about the idea of a gender construct, I know there's a lot of people who find that difficult to grasp, and I suppose as much as Judith Butler did a lot to help us understand that, certainly the language doesn't help. But I think the analogies that you've used are fantastic, and they really kind of bring it down to just expanding the diversity and allowing people to kind of understand that, you know, as much as you know, as you say, the north and south thing, it's not just north and south, and there's so much expanse within that, and we should therefore kind of allow that binary doesn't always have to prescribe to that either, or gender rather doesn't always have to prescribe to that. But I didn't actually introduce you properly. So I should say that you are the vice chair of TENI, the Trans Equality Network Ireland, and you've been with them on the board since 2016. You're also a founding member of the Trans Support Alliance, and you're also on the board of SWAY, Sex Workers Alliance Ireland. Yeah, and also since 2016. Yeah. So, but just, you know, I mentioned with Noah that we would just introduce TENI, and also I actually wanted to ask you about the Trans Support Alliance. So let's start with TENI to introduce it to some of our viewers who wouldn't be familiar.
Yeah, so TENI is a non-profit membership-driven organisation founded in 2006. And our mission is to advance the rights and equality of trans people and their families. And we work across a lot of different areas. So obviously Noah is working in the healthcare area, which is one of our most important areas of work, because healthcare can be a huge issue for trans people, getting access to healthcare and good quality healthcare. But we also work in areas like education, across all three sectors of education, in employment equality. We worked for gender recognition with the original gender recognition bill passed in 2015, and we're currently working towards proposals the government has to improve gender recognition. We cover a lot of different areas, so healthcare, education, gender recognition, employment equality, also family and individual support. So we do provide support directly to people. You might have a young trans person who's coming out to their family, and we help the family, assist them in that process. Or you might have people coming out later in life and they're coming out to, their children or to their other extended family. So we work across a really wide range of areas, because we're the only professional national trans organization in Ireland. So we have to kind of cover a lot of different things. But like, for example, hopefully we'll be getting some improvements to the gender recognition legislation down the line. And obviously non-binary gender recognition is going to form part of that. There's a lot of different countries around the world have some form of gender recognition for non-binary people, but not Ireland. And I can maybe talk about some of the ways that negatively impacts non-binary people in their day-to-day lives later on as well. But there was something you were saying there a minute ago about gender being a social construct. It reminded me something I want to say, for people who, it seems like a very strange idea that gender is a social construct, because the idea of biological sex and gender identity are so closely tied together. And also what we think of as biological sex is itself socially constructed and very complicated. It's not a simple thing in itself. But I think for someone, for a cis person who's watching this, who knows very little about trans issues, and they're watching this to try and learn more and understand more, it could very easily seem like, well, how can gender be a social construct? Because if you're brought up in any given society, whether it's today or at any point in history, you're going to have a snapshot kind of view of what gender identity is, because until very recent decades, these things haven't tended to evolve very quickly. But actually, when you look back over the whole sweep of history and you look around the world, ideas of what is male or female vary massively from one society to another. Different societies construct different ideas of what it means to be male, what it means to be female, and indeed what it means to be non-binary as well. And Europe is actually a massive outlier in the whole world in terms of there being fewer non-binary or transgender identities recorded in European history. But not just that, there are plenty of examples of trans people in European history, but also they weren't afforded the same recognition or equality or esteem that were given in other societies. There's plenty of places around the world, North America, the Pacific Islands, pretty much everywhere actually in the world apart from Europe, we'll find lots and lots of examples of trans people who were respected, who were part of their societies, who had a long history within those societies. And it's really only when Europeans turned up with guns and flags that, they start pushing very binary, cis-normative ideas of what gender identity is. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know, maybe we'd live in a much nicer world. One mistake people make, I think a well-meaning mistake people make sometimes, is looking at trans identities and non-binary identities, though, in these, and these are very European terms that I'm using, like trans and non-binary, and looking at gender identities in other parts of the world and saying, that's a trans woman, or that's a non-binary person, and assuming that, the European label is equivalent to, for example, I think I'm not sure, is in the Pacific Island, Halpin people and Hijra people in the Indian subcontinent. It's debatable whether, for how many people who identify that, trans woman or non-binary would be the equivalent term in European identities. It's trying to put one frame of reference onto another.
Yeah, no, and I think colonialism has a lot to answer for in so many ways, but certainly kind of imposing binary structures and patriarchy and all the rest. But that kind of is an interesting point for me to maybe bring in Olive, because Olive identifies as she/her pronouns, and is one of the founding members and a committee member of Intersex Ireland. It was founded in 2018, and it's one of the only face-to-face groups for intersex people in Ireland. Olive is also a volunteer with the Switchboard, which have a dedicated night specifically for trans and intersex callers, and for people supporting trans and intersex people, and it's on Friday nights, and it's the lines are manned by trans and intersex people, or volunteers. So I suppose, in light of what we've just been discussing in terms of binary and non-binary and gender, it's important to point out that intersex doesn't always, and sometimes more often, doesn't fall within the trans. It doesn't kind of fall within trans, but there are intersex people who will identify as trans, and I think you're going to explain more of that. But basically, I suppose, start off to some of our viewers and maybe just try and explain what intersex is and how it differs from trans.
Intersex people are individuals born with any of several variations in sex characteristics, including chromosomes, gonads, sex hormones, or genitals that do not fit typical definitions for male or female bodies. And there's 43 variations. And these present at different times of an individual's life. So someone could be born with ambiguous genitalia. There could be a diagnosis at puberty. There could be a diagnosis when somebody is finding it difficult to have either sexual intercourse or possibly to get pregnant. There could be, we've also had instances where people have had diagnosis after they've died through postmortems. So it could be diagnosed at any age.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, certainly before we've been talking, a lot of my understanding was that it was purely a physiological, that it related to the genitalia more so than any of the other forms that you've talked about. But also, so when we say that there are intersex people who will identify as trans and who won't, do you want to maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Sometimes the child may be born with ambiguous genitalia, and what often happens is a doctor decides, okay, we're going to decide that this child is male or female, and we'll wear them as that. And then the child, during the development, realize their own gender, which we all do. And at that stage, then often they can then identify as trans, but some don't. Some say the doctor made a mistake. I am not, you know, and I think the important thing for us is that we identify who we are ourselves, that there's no definition put on us. And a huge thing would be bodily autonomy, because it's, I mean, when I was diagnosed, it was like, listen, this is what's wrong with you, but we can't fix you. You know, we can fix you. And I was a 14-year-old kid, and I was being told, you know, and it's very much medical. I'm a lesbian. For me, being a lesbian, it was over a process of time when I came to terms with my own sexual orientation. When I was being diagnosed with the intersex condition, I was shown the results of scans and blood tests, which were put across the table and told, this is what you are. And it was like, I had absolutely no idea. And that after diagnosis is a very vulnerable time for a lot of people, because this label is being put on you that from something that you'd no idea. You know, I'm thinking in particular of a married heterosexual woman living in rural Ireland, who hadn't, you know, couldn't understand why she wasn't getting pregnant and wasn't menstruating, and what was, you know, what was going on in her body. And suddenly she was being told she had an intersex condition, and the level of panic in her, that and also the level of panic in parents when a child is born with ambiguous genitalia. And a lot of times then the parents don't know anyone.
Yeah.
We are the only face-to-face group in Ireland. And so there's a level of panic, and in many instances surgery is opted for, which can be detrimental long term. I mean, and that is why there is a difference between trans and intersex, because for intersex people, when they're doing surgery, the doctor is trying to do surgery on tissue that's scarred. So it is a lot more complicated. You know, if you cut nerves, they can't regrow. You know, and it's a more difficult surgery, and I would have known people who actually who hemorrhaged after gender surgery.
Yeah. Wow.
And you know, and there are huge difficulties around that, and it's done as well in a sense of panic. Or afterwards, the parents feel guilty. There's anger. There's pain. There's you know, there's a huge fallout emotionally throughout the life in some instances. And we've no counselling. We've no counselling in this country for people who are intersex. We don't have you know, there is no services, and it's hugely problematic.
Yeah, it's I mean, from what you're describing, and I know we will talk more about healthcare, but certainly, you know, from the later diagnoses that you're discussing, it sounds like the kind of humanity is taken out of it, and it really becomes so clinical and so impersonal and kind of disempowering to the person to learn about those diagnoses. But also, you know, from my understanding, one of the thing with intersex people who identify as trans, and this is where the surgery is coming in, and I kind of misheard, but I think just for our viewers who aren't familiar, to understand that very often a parent is presented with a baby and they're diagnosed as intersex, and the parent is asked to choose a sex for their baby. In some cases, I know not in all cases, but in some cases, and that's where the surgery is.
Usually the doctor, I mean, it's really a situation of doctors playing God, you know. Okay. And I think it's that is the anger. You know, it's not whether someone identifies as trans and intersex. It's the fact that there's such anger about what was done to them to their bodies as babies, and the whole complete lack of bodily autonomy has been totally taken away from them from a very young age. And I think that is probably the central difference between trans and intersex is that this would be an issue in the intersex community that we're trying to get stopped. Is all unnecessary surgery that's done on babies must be stopped. It's actually seen by the UN as a form of torture, and yet Ireland is doing it, and we're paying for it as being taxpayers, and it really, we really need very strong legislation that this must stop. It also, what Cruel was saying, it really fits into that, because this is like, you must be either male and female, and you must fit in this binary, you must fit in this box, and we don't care what we have to do to get you back in it. And we will do highly specialized intensive surgery on a newborn baby to get you back in the box, because the box is the main thing.
Well, I mean, again, there's a lot of that kind of harks back to our Irish kind of state and other influences on the state and how that's played out.
We do call it gender surgery as well, because it's forcing them into a gender that they may not necessarily agree with at all. This mightn't be that they're going to be put into this box. Yeah.
Well, just to bring Noah and Cruel back in, and in terms of, I mean, obviously we've now kind of highlighted the differences within each of the kind of identities and all of that, and we've also all touched on healthcare, and obviously those healthcare needs are very, very specific to each group, but I mean, Noah, with This Is Me and your push on healthcare, I know that you, at the time, you were very actively engaging with, was it Simon Harris? And what were kind of some of the really kind of pressing, urgent kind of matters that you were trying to really drive home with them?
Well, I'd say that the kind of the pressing matters, a couple of years ago when I was involved with This Is Me, are the same as the pressing matters that are still happening today. So generally for the community, it's not like This Is Me in general, it's for the community. Is what I'd always say is that, we don't have adequate gender affirming healthcare in Ireland. We do not practice international best practice standards of care, which are guided by WPATH, the World Association for Transgender Health. So, what is advised, what is international best practice standards of care would be what they would call an informed consent model of care. So that means that, people can make their own decisions with their own healthcare as long as they are informed about, maybe side effects or what that means for that person in terms of their health and their body and things like that. Whereas in Ireland, we run this, we practice this very psychiatric model of care, which is considered, widely by the trans community in general as being a very gatekeeping model of care, meaning that it's based off a person having to prove themselves as opposed to a person being believed, meaning that we go through these very unnecessary, kind of very irrelevant psychiatric assessments, very long, very invasive, can be quite traumatic for people. And oftentimes, as the world, or as WPATH would say, that a lot of the questions that were asked aren't relevant, and that what is suggested is not that. When we say an informed consent model, that doesn't mean anyone can just walk into a GP and 5 minutes later walk out with hormones. That's not what that means. It's a little bit more complex than that. It's it involves what's called a psychosocial evaluation. So it's not asking people to prove their gender to a psychiatrist. It's kind of any mental health professional having a quick sit down, making sure that that person is informed, knows what kind of treatment they're going to go on, knows what the effects of that treatment is going to be, as well as just making sure that that person is sound of mind enough at the time to make that decision for themselves. It doesn't delve into, anything to do with your sex life or anything to do with your past traumas or anything like that. And that is what we need to be doing, an informed consent model, that mental health is used as a support and not as a decision maker as to whether you gain treatment or not. So what we are still kind of experiencing in Ireland, like I said, is this kind of psychiatric model of care, whereas we need to move towards international best practice. And in doing that, we need to decentralize trans or gender affirming healthcare in Ireland and put it out into the community. You know, our service here in Ireland is centralized in one hospital. We're not sick people. We don't need to be treated in hospitals. It's very simple for us to be treated in the community like everybody else. As well as that, we have no surgery options. We have very little, surgery options in Ireland for anyone who does wish to avail of gender affirming surgeries. So currently we only have what's called top surgery. So that would be a chest surgery for trans feminine people. That's the only surgery option that we have in the country for trans people. We do have one private surgeon that will provide top surgery for trans masculine people. However, she is private and extremely costly. And as we know, trans people are disproportionately affected by unemployment and poverty. So, you know, we don't just all have 9,000 to 12,000 euro down the back of the couch. So it means that almost, you know, the majority of people who do wish to have surgery are being sent abroad, and most of those people need to privately fundraise for that money. If you want to simply access hormone replacement therapy, the current waiting list for the service that we have here in Ireland is currently sitting at about 3 years plus. To even access hormone replacement therapy. So, you know, the World Health Organization declassified trans identities as mental health or behavioral disorders 2 years ago, but unfortunately in Ireland, we're still treating them as such. So, you know, the pressing issues are in healthcare, decentralizing, changing the model of care is what's going to fix everything. Well, not fix everything, but it's going to really help to improve the treatment of trans people, the access to care, the pathway to care. And it's important to note that not every trans person wants to medically transition. Not every person under the trans umbrella wants medical intervention. Not everyone wants hormones. Not everyone wants surgery. Some people want hormones, don't want surgery, want hormones, don't want surgery. You know, it's very varied and it's very specific to people.
Well, it's also, I think it's important to note, you know, in that pathologization and in that inhibiting of healthcare and access, even just to hormones and stuff like that, that in itself is actually creating more healthcare issues by perpetrating kind of, you know, depression and other mental health issues that all, you know, the queer community generally are disproportionately prone to, but particularly in the trans community. Olive, I just wanted to ask, in terms of as we're talking, that kind of pathologization and that need for trans people to go through that process with a psychologist. Are there similar kind of protocols for intersex people to go through?
Yeah, you see, it depends really with intersex, like you know, a lot of intersex people shy away from cisgendered and transgendered because we feel that's allowing the doctor to play, in our instance, to play God. Because if someone's got a, you know, say with our, you know, where there's a mixture of male and female characteristics. So but in saying that, my whole thing is that both intersex and trans need bodily autonomy, and that's I think the bottom line for both. And I think that is where the crossover is. And we have quite a number of intersex people who do identify as trans and who happily identify as trans as well. And I think that they need to be remembered as well. Intersex is very diverse. Like you'll have the people who don't want, who feel the doctor fecked this up. They don't want to be identified as either cis or trans. You have people who identify as cis and you have people who identify as trans, all within the one umbrella. Because there is 43 variations And within that, you also have hormonal, you've chromosomes, you have gonads, you have sex, you've the variety of sexual characteristics. And it's very, very diverse,
So we talked about the Gender Recognition Act, which was introduced in 2015. And one of the great things that I should mention about that is that it was one of the first acts that when it was introduced, that there was a clause included that it would be reviewed. And that's some of the work that you guys are doing with Tenny. But in terms of the recognition, the gender recognition and the legalities around that, that obviously plays into the healthcare and well, from my understanding from this discussion is that it does have an impact on the healthcare. But what are the other ways that it also impacts?
Well, it wouldn't have a direct impact on healthcare. I mean, in theory, our gender recognition legislation is such that it's, for an adult at least, it's a self-declaration process. You fill out the paperwork and say, this is who I am, and that's it. In other countries, and in older legislative models for gender recognition, you would have had to provide proof that you had gone through some kind of medical treatment. Now, that obviously put people that would have put people, if it had been introduced here, and it did put people in other countries in a very difficult position where, you're coming out as trans, say I was a trans woman and I was coming out and I want to get my gender, my legal gender recognized, but I also want to be able to access transition-related healthcare. Which order, do I do those in? I'm going to have to do gender recognition, legal gender recognition after healthcare. So I'm going to be, trying to first socially transition and come out to people in my life and maybe, dress and express myself the way that I want to, while all my documents, all my paperwork, all my ID shows the wrong gender on it. Or I'm going to start undergoing hormone replacement therapy to transition, and again, all my documentation is going to be wrong for that. So that's going to put me in a very vulnerable position where I'm going to be outed maybe on a daily basis when people look at my ID and say, well, this doesn't look like you, or it says male when you're a woman, or Now, we avoided that in Ireland after a lot of very hard work by Tenny and a lot of other organizations to improve the legislation that we got. And eventually we got what was at the time the best gender recognition legislation anywhere in the world. Now, it's since been leapfrogged and overtaken by the legislation in a lot of other countries, and we've fallen behind again. The government published its response to the gender recognition review in, I think, November or December of 2019. But then a couple of months later, we had a general election, and there are promises in the programme for government to implement those recommendations along with others. But, it's coming, and so is Christmas. So, there's a lot of work still to be done. And COVID has thrown everything off schedule and everything. And before that, Brexit threw everything off schedule. And I'm sure next year, the asteroid that will be heading to Earth, or the zombie apocalypse, or whatever the world will have in store for us next after COVID, will delay things again. But so healthcare and gender recognition aren't necessarily tied together. One isn't and shouldn't be dependent on the other. But obviously, it can impact people's lives in terms of they have to make decisions about which order they want to change certain things in their life if they're going to change things. For non-binary people, healthcare in relation to transition is, a little bit extra complicated because, as Noah said, not everyone wants to have every medical procedure and medical intervention that's available. If someone feels uncomfortable with a part of their body, they might want to have the treatments that are necessary to relieve that discomfort. But, if they need to go on hormones to improve how they feel about their body, and that gets them to a point where they say, okay, look, I feel comfortable now. It doesn't make sense to require that person to have surgery. And I think that's one of the other problems for a lot of people who come out as non-binary. They might have previously identified as trans man or trans woman. And what a lot of people have said to me is they felt that there was a pressure on them as a trans person that if they were going to come out, they had to kind of come all the way out. They had to transition completely from one to another. So they might say, someone might come out as a trans man and they feel that in order to be taken seriously as a trans man or to be recognized and respected and treated as a man, they have to be, the manliest man that ever manned. And they have to go right to the end of the kind of male end of the spectrum. And that's not because that's how they identify, but they feel pressure from people around them to do that in order to be recognized as who they are. And maybe later on they decide, actually, I identify with 90% of masculinity, but there's another 10% that is my identity is more complex and nuanced, and maybe I'm non-binary, and people later on maybe come out as non-binary as a result. But for non-binary people, I think as well as an added barrier of, well, I don't know, can I access any kind of transition related healthcare? Do I need to be a trans man or a trans woman to get access to transition? And people will feel a lot of pressure to, present in a certain way and identify in a certain way in order to get any medical help whatsoever. I think as well, like through all three of us, the things we've been talking about here, particularly what Olive was saying earlier about bodily autonomy, you can see a theme running through, I think, a lot of things in Irish society where, if we decide that people don't fit in the box that we want them to, we are very happy to take away their autonomy and let other people make decisions for them. And we've done that, with reproductive healthcare. I think during the repeal the eighth referendum, there was a lot of people were swayed by the testimony of male politicians or male doctors more so than listening to people who'd had pregnancies and wanted to have an abortion. I think with people on the autism spectrum, with trans people, with queer people in general, with intersex people, we're very quick to kind of medicalize any difference and try and stamp it out. And it's a very paradoxical situation then where you have, intersex infants being forced through a medical process without any consent. And on the other hand, you have trans people who are waiting years and having barriers put in front of them to get healthcare that they want to try and feel more comfortable in their bodies. But coming back to the legislation, like I said, we're waiting on some movement on gender recognition. Hopefully that's going to include non-binary gender recognition and also recognition to make the process easier for 16 to 18-year-olds, because it's a self-determination process for over 18s. Okay. But there's a lot of additional administrative barriers for people 16 to 18, and then there's no recognition for someone under 16. So, if you're a trans girl going to secondary school, you have no legal right to be, you have no legal protection to be able to say, I'm a girl, this is the uniform that I should be wearing, this is how teachers should address me in class. You don't have those same protections that other students would have. Yeah. So that puts people in a very vulnerable place at a very vulnerable time in their lives. So we need gender recognition for young people as well. But like I said, we're still waiting on that.
Everybody thought that 2015 was a fix. We had marriage recognition, we had gender recognition, and it was all this great big fix. And we obviously know, and what part of what this series is about is to try and kind of find ways that we can kind of learn from that and grow from that. And I know we've looked at a lot of the problems that are facing, the issues in terms of trans and in terms of gender identity and intersex conditions and stuff. So on a kind of, just to finish up on a kind of a positive note and putting this out to everyone, what are ways that the kind of the queer community can really help the wider society to understand, issues still faced within the community, and particularly in terms of gender and stuff?
I think for some people, I think a lot of people within the LGBT community itself have kind of, since the marriage referendum, and maybe even more so maybe since the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, tuned out a little bit of certain issues within the community. Not all, there's a lot of people out there doing an awful lot of activism all the time. But, even things like parental rights for same-sex couples, there's very limited parental rights there for lesbian couples who go through fertility clinics in Ireland, but for people who need to go through surrogacy, or people who, haven't gone through one of those clinics or have gone abroad, just an issue like parental rights, which you would think would be a very mainstream LGBT issue, when you compare the amount of attention it's gotten from media nationally, or from even a lot of people within the LGBT community who've tuned out since 2015 2015 or 2018, just people going off and finding out about those issues, looking at the work that organizations like Tenny or Belong To or Shout Out or others are doing, and finding out what's going on, first of all. And then, I don't know, I suppose maybe something very similar to what people did with the marriage referendum. Talk to your friends about it. If there's a protest or some action taking place, or about a campaign that some organization is running, get involved with that. The same people in your life that you would have gone to and talked about why it was important for them to vote yes to the marriage equality referendum or to the repeal of the 8th Amendment, go and talk to them about why, hey, look, I'm going to start doing this thing to try and get better access for healthcare for trans people. Will you come with me to do this thing? Will you get involved? Yeah. But I think the first step is that the queer community ourselves need to kind of wake up a little bit to the fact that a lot of these issues are still outstanding. Not just, you might be someone who's not trans, who doesn't need trans healthcare, doesn't need gender recognition, but maybe, you do care about LGBT rights in general, and you want to help out trans people. And also you might want to be a parent one day, and you might want to make sure that you have the parental rights that currently we still, 6 years after the referendum, we still don't have in Ireland. So getting yourself mobilized, finding out about those issues, and then looking at the organizations like Tenny that are out there doing work on this and coming to them saying, look, what can I do to help?
I would absolutely mirror what Carol said. Just because you don't identify as something, or you don't feel that you want something in particular, doesn't mean that you can't help fight for it. So, I mean, yes, exactly. So it means, you don't have to be trans to fight for trans rights. You don't have to be living with HIV to fight for improvement of services for people living with HIV. You do not have to be a sex worker to fight for the rights of sex workers. You do not have to be intersex to fight for the rights of intersex people. And it's making sure that you're educated on the issues that still face, and I'm going to say your community, because we are a community as a whole, in that, like Cruel mentioned, the parenting rights for same-sex couples, as well as we have many other issues going on. We have, hate crime legislation needs to be introduced, prohibition of conversion therapies bill, people living with the HIV crisis in Ireland is, in Ireland, we have double the European average of new HIV diagnoses per year, which would mean that, HIV epidemic was not something of the 80s and 90s. Statistically, Ireland are in a HIV epidemic at the moment. You don't have to be living with HIV to know that that's a problem and that needs to end. We just need to educate ourselves on the different problems facing our community, and know that we don't necessarily have to identify as such or experience such, and are able to talk about it, and to talk to our friends about it, and educate other people, and join campaigns, and donate to groups who are actively fighting, and organizations that are actively advocating for the rights of minorities in this country. I don't have to be living in direct provision to know that it's wrong, and to know that it needs to end. So it takes, as I always say, in terms of being trans, and this is the case for many minority groups, we're a small army, and we do need people's help. We don't need you to talk for us, but we need you to listen to us and amplify our voices, and include us in those conversations, include us in those media articles, include us in sitting at the table with decision makers. So, there's many ways people can get involved, and, just because it doesn't directly affect you doesn't mean it's not wrong, and doesn't mean you can't do anything about it.
Brilliant. Thanks. Now, I might, Olive, just to finish up.
I think that we really need a comprehensive sex education. My intersex condition was hormonal, and I don't know if anyone has ever seen the film This Is Me, and the lady with the beard, that was the intersex condition I had. I got no education. This was suddenly happening in my body, and I didn't know what the hell was going on. Move on to 2021. Kids are still getting no education.
Yeah.
And the terror of actually, you're being told that your body's supposed to develop this way. Intersex bodies don't, but there's no talk, there's no education. And at the moment, like I'm talking about children's rights. I think that the most fundamental of all rights are children's rights. And at the moment, we have sent, in the last year, we sent people to jail for genital mutilation on a baby. And yet it's acceptable in Irish society to do similar surgery on purely because the baby is intersex.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself is horrific discrimination. That you can do surgery on if you do surgery on one baby, that baby, because that baby is not intersex, you can be sent to jail, do surgery on the other baby. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you know, and the long-term consequences of genital mutilation, that's what we call it within our communities, genital mutilation, because that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
And the long-term consequence, we need that made illegal. The UN have said that we are actually torturing our babies in this.
Yeah.
And that's a form of torture, and yet it's legal in Ireland. So that we really need to make that illegal. It's what I feel. You know, for me, I think children's rights, I feel very strong about it. I feel that if we can protect intersex and trans children,
yeah, yeah,
I think the developmental damage that's done to children when they have suffered all these different forms of exclusion and abuses is just detrimental.
Olive, is there a way for people to contact Intersex Ireland?
Yeah, our we have Facebook, and we have also got a Gmail. We Facebook or Messenger. Yeah.
Just Intersex Ireland on Facebook.
Yeah. And if you like us, and you can message us, you know.
Brilliant. Okay. And Noah, sorry,
I just want to say it's, you know, we have been talking an awful lot about, you know, the really serious issues that still face different sections of the community. But I think it's also really important to note that, you know, Ireland does have a bleak past when it comes to equality, oppression and things like that. But we are also a country that in a very short period of time have come on an awful lot. You know, decriminalization of homosexuality was only in 1993. That was and on the 24th of June, on my second birthday exactly, was homosexuality decriminalized. So that was 28 years ago in this June. So in that time period, in the last 6 years, we've also seen this, you know, this big increase in, you know, people coming out and saying things aren't right. We got marriage equality, we got gender recognition, we repealed the 8th Amendment. We are now on this, you know, although it seems slow in the intervening kind of years, when you look at the past, we are a country that is moving quite fast with big legislative positive changes. And we just need to keep on that train, and we need to keep pressing. And I think we're on a positive road, and we need to keep doing that.
Back to where we began, a lot of that has come through grassroots movements. And from what we were just finishing up saying, a lot of that has just been about hearing the stories, hearing people's stories, understanding, educating ourselves, and learning to give voice. And I think really that's what this is kind of coming down to. So just very lastly, how can people get in touch with Tenny?
I think if you Google transgender and Ireland, we're like the first result that comes up on Google. So, or if you search for TENI, Tenny, on Facebook, on Twitter, on the Instagram, on Google, whatever. If you go onto the website actually, and you can become a member of Tenny there and vote in our general assemblies, and you'll get the newsletter and everything like that. But if you follow us on social media, you'll see what we're up to. Just search for Transgender Equality Network Ireland, and you'll find us. But becoming a member is a really good way to have input into what the organisation is doing and the strategy.
Brilliant. Well, great. Listen, thank you very much, everyone. And I really appreciate your contribution. It's been great to hear everybody's insights, and hopefully just people can kind of be aware of some of the issues that we're all facing within the community. So next week we'll be talking about disability. So please tune in for that. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.